Joan Emmeline, after discovering she was capable of amazing and magical abilities, was a fugitive now from her own town. She had been walking west for about a day now, deep into the uncharted wilds of western Connecticut. A large flowing creek was given to her like her own personal miracle. She fought off her dehydration by cupping the fresh water in her hands. By now she was feeling far enough away from the town that wanted her dead. She got to setting up a tent, just using some branches and shrubs against the corner of a U-shaped boulder formation, creating a small circle of other rocks and filling it with dried twigs and branches. She looked at the pile and with her mind sparked a fire. She was comfortable enough given the situation, and was even able to sleep through the night despite the occasional waking from stomach growls at her hunger. Joan was clever. She quickly realized hunting and trapping were not really needed. Sitting at the creek, she waited for shadows of fish and then lifted them from the water with her magical tether. She would make the flopping fishes float right to the fire and keep them suspended to cook. Joan survived this way for many months. Her makeshift camp had grown quite a bit. She had formed a garden, constructed a better tent, and had even learned to rotate her food supply to avoid overhunting and thinning out the population of squirrels and rabbits and fish. Being a loner, the stillness and isolation of her new home among the creek and forest was not a hard adjustment. Prior to these months alone in the forest, her only human interactions were at the market and the occasional chat with Pastor Neil. She had supplemented that by having conversations with herself, the silence often being broken by her outbursts of laughter as her internal monologues helped entertain herself. She had formed a fictional personality to live alongside her in her head. She survived winter by making circles of fire around her camp. She had sewn squirrel and rabbit pelts together into a robe using plant fibers twisted together into thread. She had a stash of smoked meats and fish, and with good discipline and rationing she was able to stretch the supply. But she was running low. She was not sure she could make it through the winter. With no garden to tend or animals to fish or to collect, she found plenty of time to sit and think. Malda, the name given to Joan's imaginary friend, was extra curious on this certain snowy day. "Joan, what else can you do?" Looking at the falling snow in the sky, Joan answered, "I suppose that I am not sure." Malda with a mischievous response, "I imagine if you tried, you could do anything." Joan and Malda sat in silence. Their shared imaginations worked together. Malda was the first to break the silence. "Fire is nature, is it not?" Joan and Malda considered it, and Joan's attention turned to the now winter-dead garden, containing the hibernating asparagus, spinach, lovage, and other herbs found and planted during the spring and summer seasons. Joan walked to the garden, placed her hands to the dirt, and through her numbing hands on the frozen ground, she tried to connect herself to the earth and the cycle of life. She thought of the roots and the nutrients they needed from the soil. She thought of the worms that helped form the earth, of which the plants would grow, and the insects, bugs, and animals that all relied on the vegetation. Joan had worked herself into a meditative trance. Hours went by. It wasn't until she felt the early stages of frostbite did she snap out of it. And then she could see one tiny green bud poking through the frozen and lifeless ground. She started a flame and made it hover in front of her to warm her hands and called out, "Malda, Malda, look, you were right." Kneeling and placing her hands back to the ground, she stayed still and returned to her hypnotic state. By the next morning, the falling snow had covered everywhere but the warm ring of fire Joan had around the garden and herself. But in those snowy woods, only one little pocket of area looked like summer. Joan, overnight, had made every plant bud and start growing. By the 18th hour, she had made the entire garden bloom and grow its produce. She had a large feast, roasting and eating everything she had grown. Joan said it tasted no different. However, Malda swore it tasted even better when grown with magics. So this was Joan's life for the next few years, going from surviving to thriving. That first winter, she built her own cabin by lifting rocks and stones and throwing them rapidly and in great numbers at trees. She was able to make a type of sandblaster saw blade. lifting the logs with her powers into place and stacking them for the walls. She waded into the creek to gather clay and smeared it along the logs, and with her fire made the clay harden, sealing any gaps. Cutting logs into flat lumber was tough, but with some patience, she was able to succeed even at that. They turned out pretty good, too, with the exceptions of a few splinters in her feet every now and then. The years spent alone in that forest were beginning to take its toll on her. Her reliance on Malta not only was no longer sufficient, but was also increasing her madness. Her illusions of grandeur were becoming dangerous, and her desire to share her abilities and be loved for them was now an obsession. Joan had just finished growing the new garden with her powers, and that's when she noticed there was something new forming. Little mushrooms. A lot of them, too. She dug some of them out of the ground, and some of them she found growing right up on the surface. She plucked them all. She made skewers with them and squirreled chunks that night. Shortly after she finished her dinner, the fireplace in her cabin sparkled, and Malta appeared to her. Joan was in awe. She had never seen Malta. She was always just the voice in her head. But when she saw her, she almost cried with joy. Malta was beautiful. She didn't look anything like Joan. She kind of assumed that she would. Malta did not have blonde hair like Joan did. Malta had red hair with green eyes. She was a little taller, too. Malta stood before Joan and then held her close, giving her a whisper. "Joan, you need daughters. Your gifts must live on through your lineage." Malta then gave Joan visions of the future. She could see her bloodline through generations. The future echoes of events not yet occurred were ringing back through time to her. To this day, there's debate among the witches of the cult. Some say the mushrooms were grown of her own magic and therefore boosted her abilities, while others claim they were just simply psychedelic. Joan never considered the possibility that the mushrooms were anything more than the product of her magical abilities. The following day, she made a new plot in a new garden, and she focused on growing solely mushrooms, all different kinds, anything she could think of, and she tried to push all of her energy into all of them. During her experiments with the mushrooms she was growing, she discovered that when she smashed the mushrooms to a paste and smeared it to her broom handle, that if she then straddled it, the effects would heighten. One of those nights, Malta came to her and simply said, "Joan, make the broom fly, and you can be as the birds above." Joan, still keeping the broom between her legs, used her levitation abilities on the large stick with dried grass tied to its end. The makeshift broom lifted, and Joan balanced and went up with it. She went outside, and Joan flew. That summer night, the flapping bats of the remote forest had a new companion to share the sky with. The stars above her transformed and shifted into spirals and telescopes, letting her see into the galaxies beyond. Malta's words of family stayed lodged in her heart. She knew that she needed to take action. Her gifts could not die with her. Joan focused all of her energies on the mushroom garden. She experimented with different mixtures, now including herbs and roots. She used her magics to help fuse them all together. She was starting to create ointments and creams and paste, all with different attributes. Disinfectants, scar healing, hair growth, to name a few. But it was one special one in which she was able to hatch a plan from. By dipping her finger into the newest pasty batch, her muscles heated. She felt attractive and flirty. This was her answer. She had found it. With this new discovery, she was able to hatch a plan. As the sun set, Joan flew her broom to Whitby. It had grown so much since she had seen it years ago. The rotting skeleton of her old home still remained. She could see it as she circled high above. She was looking for one person in particular, the only one she ever trusted, really, Pastor Neil. The chapel's windows glowed from the candles within, and she touched down right outside, her new concoction wrapped in a leaf. She entered the chapel doors, not worried at the loud, alarming creak it made. Pastor Neil stepped from the back office to greet his visitor. He was in shock. "Joan?" he stammered in awe. Joan looked disheveled, dirty, and her walk was no longer timid and reserved, but had great strides of confidence despite her appearance. She approached Pastor Neil, remaining silent to all of his questions. "Why are you here? What happened to you?" She lifted her hand, and he trustingly accepted the polite gesture of a shake, only to feel the smearing of a strange substance in her grip. It was her new creation. That night, flying home, she could already sense the new life starting inside her. That's when Malta died. Dismissed from Joan's mind, Malta was no longer needed. She would now have a family of her own and a student to teach, someone to share her glorious gift with. Tune in next time for part 3. We will see how Joan raises her daughter as the first member of her coven, and then discover what happens when first contact with the natives of the land is made.